Hello everybody. This is the fourth podcast in the series entitled Who Rules Over Us? In this podcast, we will look more carefully at the rise of superorganisms and at why they are so dangerous. Because it is no coincidence that war, carnage, slavery, abuse, the depletion of resources, financial meltdowns, and other dreadful horrors have been associated with these things, perhaps mostly because they can actually change our reality. They really can, as we shall see. And in the first three podcasts, we looked at how our lives are so very heavily dominated by such superorganisms, huge entities that shape our view of the world, such as Christianity, feminism, government, the BBC, Hollywood. These superorganisms are made up of real people who collude together in order to benefit themselves in some way. And by this, as we saw in the third podcast, we mean that people collude together in order to empower themselves. The acquisition of power being the motive behind almost everything that people say, think, and do. And so it is very easy to see how these superorganisms arise in the first place and how they grow. Quite simply, people get together and form groups to benefit themselves. And if they are successful in creating groups that are capable of accruing power for themselves, then these groups will continue to grow and to become more powerful. Power begets power, and some of them, like Christianity, government, can become so powerful that they grow to be huge and very influential, and they can last for more than 1,000 years. And there are a number of things about this phenomenon, the arising of superorganisms, that are truly mind-boggling in their implications, particularly given that, as we saw in the first two podcasts, our minds are almost totally dominated by these things. Indeed, the very reality that we experience is, to a very large extent, actually created by these superorganisms. Just as interesting is the fact that superorganisms are bound to arise. They are inevitable as a result of our biological natures. And the reason that these superorganisms are bound to arise is obvious when you think about it. They arise, quite simply, because people colluding together can wield far more power and hence can survive and flourish more successfully than can one person on his own. And if you understand the way in which evolution works for biological bodies, then you will understand that the same principles must apply to these superorganisms. And so this isn't speculation. This is a fact, a scientific fact, a mathematical fact. People who collude together to empower themselves are going to be far more successful in numerous important areas of life, including survival and reproduction and comfort, than are people who do not collude together. Statistically speaking, this notion is just as valid as is the notion that 1 + 1 = 2. And so, this is not only a scientific fact, a mathematical fact, it is an evolutionary fact as well. Human beings, as a result of their natures and their capabilities, will create superorganisms, and you cannot stop them from doing so. For example, and loosely speaking, how can you stop 10 people colluding together to empower themselves, unless you create another powerful group to oppose them Either way, win or lose, you end up with a superorganism that exists. In other words, they are inevitable, given our natures and our capabilities. Indeed, if a human being speaks a language, a common language, then this is already evidence that his mind has been infected by at least one superorganism. So, in short, superorganisms arise because people can collude with each other to empower themselves, which is their main motive in life, as we saw in the third podcast, and they end up being far more powerful and influential than individuals could ever be. And some of them are so powerful that they can last for thousands of years. You could get rid of the president or the pope tomorrow, and all their topmost cronies in the White House or the Vatican, the topmost echelons, all gone. But still, government and Catholicism would continue to exist. In fact, they might even grow in size and in power in response to getting rid of those top people. That's how enduring and how powerful they are. And in the first two podcasts, we also looked at just how enormous is the influence of these superorganisms upon our minds, so enormous, in fact, that there is barely any room, if any, in our minds left for us, for our own unique thoughts and ideas. These days, with the internet at hand, it is probably quite difficult to appreciate just how much our reality is shaped by these superorganisms. But I myself can certainly remember the time when my own reality was constructed by my Catholic upbringing and by a few powerful mainstream media, such as the BBC and Hollywood, which essentially told people what to think. And so, for example, I still remember a time, probably up to the age of 10, when I thought that if something particularly bad happened to someone, then there was probably a moral reason why it had happened. He died young and had a horrible death, because he had been wicked in some way. And, like many young men, I was indoctrinated with the view that my queen and country were far more important than me, and I believed it. I also had a soul which had black marks ingrained upon it whenever I sinned in some way. Now that we have the internet and many points of view coming at us from all directions, we tend to think that our minds are relatively free from such heavy influences. But this is not true. We are just as heavily influenced as were people before. It is just that the influences are not quite as well coordinated as they used to be, and they conflict more often with each other. Thus, in the past, people's minds would have been heavily influenced by, let's say, 3 or 4 highly influential superorganisms, whereas nowadays they are heavily influenced by 10 of them. But no matter how many there are, there is no escape from these beings. And in some ways, with all this extra information, this information overload, in fact, forever pouring into our minds from various electronic screens, one could even argue with much justification that, if anything, our minds are even less free than were those of people who had far more time to think and to contemplate, such as the ancient Greeks, perhaps. And so we also noted that our free will is at best very limited. Indeed, for most of the time we seem to function on autopilot, allowing ourselves to be bombarded ceaselessly by memes and ideas that invade our heads, which they do from the very moment that we are born, and the bombardment is endless. The invasion never stops, even when we are asleep, because our brains have spent their entire lives embedded in a culture, surrounded by particular people, particular events, particular ideas, and a particular environment, and your brain can never escape from the influence of these things. And hence, neither can you. Even if you don't believe in predeterminism, perhaps because of quantum physics or mathematical chaos, well, let's just call it randomness, unpredictable randomness, you still have no control over those things. You cannot control the randomness. And if you did control it, it wouldn't be random. My point being that in a fairly convincing philosophical sense, the absence of free will does not mean that there is no randomness in the world. There could be plenty of randomness and still absolutely no free will on our part. And the memes and the ideas that come mostly from the outside of our bodies are mostly arising from the superorganisms that tower over us in terms of size and influence. We as individuals have almost no impact on them, while they impact upon us mightily. And I must keep emphasizing that their main aim is to profit themselves. And if they approve of what you say, think, or do, in other words, you are empowering them, then they will smile fondly upon you. But if they do not approve, they won't. And therein lies a big problem for those of you who say, think, or do something that causes them to frown. For as we saw in the second podcast, even though these superorganisms are made up of humans, the superorganisms themselves are decidedly not human, and some of them will happily slaughter and enslave humans if it suits their purposes, as the whole of history demonstrates to us. Thus, much woe will betide you if you make these particularly malicious organisms frown, and if they happen to be powerful enough to affect you, which many of them are. So they are really worth understanding, and the very lives of you and your loved ones might soon depend on understanding them. And I kid you not when I use the word soon, because, as we shall see later on, it is very easy for those superorganisms with power to transform the very sight of you into a vision that incites your very own murder. You are worth almost nothing to these superorganisms. Even the President and the Pope are dispensable, and should they feel so inclined, they might even consider your extermination to be of considerable importance to them. Of course, often enough, they might not kill or enslave you outright, but they can demonize you, marginalize you, minimize you, deny you funding, take your money, discriminate against you, and so on. And it is surely not an exaggeration to claim that the world seems to be teetering on the brink of some disaster for much of the time. Global warming, climate change, flooding, drought, the possible mass exodus of millions of people fleeing from lands that can no longer support them, volcanoes, earthquakes, the death of the sea, the occasional tsunami, the flagging jet stream, the wandering El Niño, computers that have minds of their own, solar storms that could pulverize all our electronic communications, upon which our very lives depend, shortage of energy, food and water supplies, pollution, financial crises, excessive immigration, spread of diseases, civil unrest, and of course terrorism. Terrorism from terrorists who will soon be able to get their hands on some truly devastating weaponry, and even viruses, which can be created and unleashed, both by accident and on purpose. And in the rush to protect themselves from these horrors, some of these superorganisms might well decide that you are their target, or that you are just not worthy of their protection. And this will be particularly the case when it comes to superorganisms that reside in other countries. let's say in the Middle East at the moment, where some superorganisms seem to be particularly threatening. And so it is really important to understand these superorganisms, and at the very least to be aware of their existence. Indeed, understanding them is, in my view, far more important than understanding history, or politics, or even much of human psychology. Why? Well, because much, if not most, of our history, our politics, and our psychology is coming from them. And if there is one historical fact that my listeners surely all know, it is that the very big superorganisms, particularly those relating to government and to religion, have been responsible for some of the most disgraceful and appalling acts imaginable, and on a scale that is truly unimaginable. 1 billion people, surely, killed or butchered, maimed, deprived, degraded, enslaved. And the general principle seems to be that the more powerful and the bigger is the superorganism, the more dangerous, untrustworthy, uncaring and malicious does it have a tendency to be. It has an astronomical self-serving arrogance about it. And the bad news is that in much the same way that superorganisms are bound to arise, their existence is inevitable, the same is true for the organism of war or conflict. Human beings who were not prepared to band together to engage in wars did not make it. They were killed or enslaved or degraded by other human beings, and it was the victors who got to survive, to flourish and to reproduce, not them. And once again, given the natures and the capabilities of human beings, particularly those involving the quest for power, war and conflict have always been inevitable, because it has not been possible for such beings to live in perpetual harmony with each other. It would only take one small group to take up arms for whatever reason, and all other groups would need to arm themselves for protection. Indeed, even if nobody on the planet had any intention at the time of taking up arms, people could never rely on this, and so the very fact that some group out there might arrive on their doorstep bearing arms was sufficient to make people want to defend themselves. And this means that they would need to expend considerable resources creating superorganisms which have military purposes. And so human beings are bound to create superorganisms that are designed to kill or enslave other people. And by doing so, they create the very superorganisms that seek their own power by doing such things, killing and or enslaving people, sometimes their very own people. In other words, in order to defend themselves, human beings had to create the very superorganisms that derive their power from killing people, from violence, and so on. And these superorganisms, of course, will include all those people and ideas that are involved in supplying these organisms with the appropriate weaponry, clothing, technology, etc. And of course in creating the appropriate psychology, usually the demonization of their opponents, while sometimes elevating their own leaders to the levels of gods. And both demonization and elevation involve a great deal of deception and coercion, in some cases with hundreds of thousands, millions of young men and boys being conscripted into armies, taken away by force from their families, and sent to places unknown where they could lose limbs or die. And of course these military superorganisms needed to be resourced by people whose labour was often imposed upon them. In other words, they became slaves to these superorganisms. In short, human beings can either create superorganisms that derive their power from killing people, enslaving them, or they themselves end up dying or being enslaved. So, if they wanted to survive, they had no choice. And so, once again, the science, the maths, and the evolutionary facts tell us that this is the way that things had to be, given our natures and our capabilities. And so, even if 95% of human beings on the planet hated war, and never wanted to engage in it, they still had no choice. And if any further proof of this were needed, we only need to look at the huge efforts that various groups, even today, expend on their military resources. Homo sapiens has been around for 100,000 years or so, and yet we still need to arm ourselves to the teeth. And, putting it mildly, the track record of these big superorganisms is not that good, which is why one world government, the way that we seem to be heading, is probably not such a great idea. And the main reason for this is that people are forever seeking to empower themselves. Superorganisms with power do not sit around satisfied with what they have. And the same goes for the individuals who make them up. Which is why, for example, you will always see superorganisms trying to extend their powers and their remits. For example, in our own part of the world, those working in what I would call the abuse industry, domestic violence, sex assault, etc., will forever attempt to expand the definitions of abuse in order to get as much power and money as they can. Lawyers, police officers, and judges will want more laws so that the demand for their services will increase. Psychologists and psychiatrists will discover more ailments that need curing. The pharmaceutical industry, a huge superorganism, will convince us that we need more pills. And computer-oriented superorganisms such as Apple, Microsoft, Google, other big companies that produce things, will continue to manufacture, to extend, and to enhance their products so that they can sell more of them and so profit themselves more. In short, nobody and no superorganism wants to give up its money or its power, and they will never willingly give these things up. Only if they are forced to do so by something more powerful will they have to back down. But with one world government, who or what will be able to stop it from doing what all superorganisms and the people who serve them want to do? Which is to forever empower themselves. More jobs, bigger pensions, bigger empires, better holidays, and so on. And so, if we ever do have one world government, we can expect to see it becoming one of the most tyrannical and intrusive of superorganisms imaginable. And it is partly because the superorganisms that have power over people can change the very reality that people experience, that they are so dangerous. They can actually change the way in which people perceive others. And if there are catastrophes or shortages lying ahead of us, you can bet your last dollar that those superorganisms with power and the people who form them will look after themselves, no matter what it takes, provided that they can get away with it. But more on that later, because right now, I just want to spend a little time trying to convince you further that our reality really is shaped by the superorganisms that tower over us. And the first step here is to recognize that all you need to do is to check your own history, and you will see that your own perceptions of reality have changed on numerous occasions. Indeed, your perceptions of reality are continually changing. They can even change with a change of mood. For example, a joke that seems to be very funny when you are in a good mood is not at all funny when you are not in a good mood. Your perception of the very same joke is different. Even our hormones seem to be able to colour what we perceive. Ask any woman who has severe PMS every month, or a woman who drinks too much alcohol, or who takes drugs, both of which will have an effect on the brain's chemistry. But our perceptions of reality are forever changing even under normal circumstances. A film, a book, a video game, a piece of music, a person, can enthrall us and capture our minds, leading us to believe that these are the best things ever. That was the greatest film I've ever seen, the most fantastic book I've ever read, a video game that I will never tire of, a person whom I will love forever, so wonderful and beautiful does he or she appear to be to me. And then, a few years later, you visit again the very same film, the same book, the same video game, the same music, and a photograph of the same person. And you think, I don't really feel the same anymore. Your experience of them has now changed. Your reality is not the same as it used to be, because your brain no longer sees things in the same way. And before you started smoking or drinking alcohol, you thought, oh, what a horrible taste. Why on earth does anyone drink or smoke? But you keep trying because so many people seem to do these things. So there must be something good about them. And then perhaps you become addicted. In other words, your body seems to acquire a need for them. I'm desperate for a drink. But the important point here is that the cigarette and the alcohol now actually taste good. How did that happen? How can it be? It's exactly the same stuff that not long ago you thought was horrible. And it was exactly the same mouth that tasted it. I still remember when I gave up putting sugar in tea to make it taste sweet. At first the tea tasted awful, but it only took 2 weeks. And thereafter it tasted really good. And not long after that, any sugar in tea made the thing far too sweet for me. In fact, it tasted foul. Seems so strange that your brain can even change the taste of things and your attitude toward that taste. Well, that's the kind of thing that the brain does. The same is true for sex. When you were young, the very thought of engaging intimately with someone else's private parts was enough to make you feel ill. And then, only a few years later, you can't wait to get your hands on the private parts of that gorgeous body of his or hers. And your sexual desires change as you travel along life's pathways. Sexual situations in which you had no interest at all, or even which revolted you, now seem hugely attractive and sexy. Whereas, on the other hand, sexual situations that you have encountered 1,000 times before, well, they're not so interesting anymore. And the person whom you scored as 3 out of 10 at the beginning of the party last night scores 7 out of 10 towards the end of the party, because no one else throughout the whole evening succumbed to your irresistible charms. And so their value has increased. Your reality changes. They now seem more attractive to you, and they actually look more attractive to you. The well-known and fairly strong placebo effect is another example of how our brains can change our reality. A few pills that consist of no active ingredients at all can actually reduce people's pains and various other negative symptoms from which they claim to be suffering. And then there is the opposite of the placebo effect, called the nocebo effect, wherein people feel worse as a result of believing themselves to have been harmed by something. In medicine, this often transpires when people are told of the possible negative side effects of pills. This information can, on its own, cause those very same side effects. And outside of medicine, the effect is just as strong, and it can actually damage lives quite horrendously. For example, if you are told that situation X, no matter how trivial or unimportant, is likely to have a negative impact on your psychological well-being, then, sure enough, it will probably do so, simply because you believe it to be true. And when it comes to court cases designed to provide some sort of compensation to victims who experience these situations, it is in the interest of victims, lawyers, therapists, police officers, and even insurance companies to exaggerate the injuries, because the greater are the alleged injuries, the more money can these people make. And this includes the media, that always profit very well by focusing on misery and by creating alarm. In other words, the superorganism of the legal profession, the superorganism of the therapeutic profession, of the insurance companies, and of the media, hugely powerful superorganisms, have a vested interest in creating misery. And so this is exactly what they do. In short, they all profit by making people feel worse, and they have a huge influence on the people. And they have such power these days that they can literally deluge the public with self-serving propaganda that is actually designed to make victims feel worse, and they are very successful in doing this. And the negative effects on the people of this persistent deluge of woe from various superorganisms really is enormous. When I was a teenager in the 60s, I often worked as a hospital porter during my holidays. A hospital orderly, I think they call them now. I encountered all sorts of horrors. I don't know what hospital porters do these days, but in those days the job often involved dealing with bodies, severed parts, deep lacerations, and a lot of blood. There were numerous old, incapacitated people who had to be lifted into and out of bed at various times of the day, and they were often splattered hither and thither with bodily fluids, urine, feces, vomit, and, on the whole, a thoroughly unpleasant job, you would think. But within a week or two I was relatively unaffected by all these things, and I loved the job because I was helping people. My brain just switched off its normal responses to these horrors, and my reality changed. And something even more dramatic takes place, really, when it comes to sex. This often involves horrible smells, stickiness, soreness, blood, gums, bodily fluids, and some considerable inconvenience when it comes to contraception and risk. But this reality disappears as the sexual tension begins to rise, and our brains transform the bodies of our sexual partners into highly desirable entities. The negative aspects have all disappeared. Our reality has changed. And we can also make people believe that the most natural things in the world are perverted. We often see, for example, it expressly stated that men who have, say, peeked inappropriately up the skirts of women are perverts, as are those who have sneaked a look at the naked women coming out of the shower room. But there's nothing at all perverted about such behaviours. Inappropriate in today's culture, but hardly perverted. Most male mammals are interested in such things. There could barely be anything less perverted than the male desire for womenfolk and all their attendant bits. But somehow, people now seem to be indoctrinated with the view that this kind of behaviour reflects some perversion. In other words, an unnatural desire, which is disgusting. Which is, of course, nonsense. But many men believe this too, even though, on another level, it must be quite clear to them that it cannot be something perverted. But this is how powerful is the propaganda from superorganisms. It can even make men believe that what is totally natural for them is a sick perversion of some kind. And anyway, what exactly is so important about privacy when it comes to our bodies? In some places and times, people ran around naked and bathed with each other in public. Think of the Olympics in Greece and the public baths in Rome. But in other times and places, women actually have to cover themselves up so that you can only see their eyes. The complete opposite is true in terms of the need for privacy. And so in some places and times, people's private parts were on full display, sometimes, and nobody batted an eyelid, while in other parts of the world and at other times, the sight of a leg would have been enough to cause all sorts of psychological injury and outrage. In many times past, here in the UK, plump women were considered to be far more attractive than most. Now, however, it seems to be the skinny ones. And wealthy men in Europe would put on makeup, powder their noses, and wear fulsome wigs in order to attract the ladies. Nowadays, they'd look silly. And what you were wearing 10 years ago, you would not now be seen dead in. Fashion has changed, and so have people's tastes. And your haircut from 15 years ago, well, best not to talk about it. And the music that we like, the art, the films, the jokes, the human forms that we find attractive or unattractive, are all different in different parts of the world. The same goes for food and drinks. 60 years ago, abortion was considered to be murder by most people in the West. The fetus was regarded as a precious human being, and miscarriages were seen as the unhappy death of a person. Now, largely thanks to feminist influences, millions of people regard the very same being as nothing more than an irritating clump of worthless cells. Indeed, the word parasites is very often used by feminists to describe them. So, from being the very height of preciousness, the fetus can now be seen as an unwelcome tumour that should be thrown in the garbage can. And our emotions correspondingly fall in line with our perception of these cells. Not long ago, we treated animals like chimpanzees as if they had no feelings, and in fact as if they had no consciousness at all. People really did believe that they weren't conscious, and they were treated in the most horrible ways, even by scientists. Nowadays, most people in the West believe them to be highly conscious beings who are deserving of a considerable degree of protection. And some information can change your mind straight away. Oh my goodness, that pork pie that you just ate from the fridge, it had a worm inside it. I was just going to get rid of that. And immediately the taste of that pie will turn from being delicious to disgusting. The very taste of it will change. Oh, did you know that the person you slept with last night has a horrible disease? Bang! Everything has changed. Easier still is for our brains to alter the memories that we have, because the information that gave rise to them will have degraded over time, and they will also have been coloured and interfered with by all the new information that has poured into our brains ever since. Indeed, scientists are now showing us that our so-called memories are far more like reconstructions than recollections. Reconstructions that are based on a fairly small number of stored points that have been degrading ever since they were created. And very recently, scientists have shown that memories change every time that they are reconstructed. Indeed, a recent study showed that women's memories of their experiences of pain during childbirth, hardly the most complex of memories, distorted over time. Thus, 2 months after giving birth, the women reckoned that the pain was worse than they had assessed it to be just 2 days after birth. In other words, as time marched onwards, the women increased the amount of pain that they claimed to have felt, thus demonstrating that even simple memories cannot be relied upon, especially when it comes to feelings. 2,000 years ago, slaughtering Christians in the Roman circus was great fun, a family outing for all. And the people cheered with glee as the Christians were ripped apart by savage animals and with huge gladiatorial swords. There were guts and body parts thrown about everywhere, and the more blood that there was, the more joyful was the spectacle. And only a few decades ago, many Christians were deriving great pleasure from killing Jews, so demonized had they been. And here in the UK, we took great pleasure in bombing Germans. The more we killed, the more we cheered. We've enslaved black people and lynched them with pride on occasion, as they have done to each other in different parts of the world. And not so long ago in China, some young men and women were even slaughtering their own parents, brothers, sisters, neighbors and friends, basically because they had been successfully portrayed as being parasites on their fellow men by the powers that be. But all these people had the same biological brains that we have today. Their brains were no different. So what was different? Well, the answer is that the superorganisms that had the power in those times were different. And this is the point that I am desperately trying to make. Superorganisms can change your reality. Now, it's true to say that there are some limits to how effective superorganisms can be in changing people's reality. After all, the physical environment itself is very intrusive and hard for your brain to ignore. And so, for example, it would be quite difficult for a superorganism to convince us that we can walk through walls, or fly through the air by flapping our arms, or that the circle on the wall is a square. And our biology can be fairly intrusive too. For example, it would be hard for a superorganism to convince you that your hand does not hurt as it sits burning in a fire. And our long-term experiences can also impact themselves into our minds, and so make it difficult for a superorganism to convince us that those long-term experiences are inaccurate. For example, it would be difficult for a superorganism to convince you that your mother, who has spent 20 years looking after you, and who seemed to be a loving person, is in fact a malevolent witch who has travelled every night, when you are asleep, to an unwholesome place, where she slaughters babies, cooks them, and eats them for nourishment. So yes, the physical environment, our biology, and a history of experiences can limit the extent to which superorganisms can alter our reality. But in fact, we do have examples of people being convinced of such unlikely things, including walking through walls, putting hands in fires without pain, and as we have seen, people can be convinced that their innocent parents should be slaughtered. And we have recently had examples of people being convinced that their parents were actually devils, who were abusing them when they were youngsters, in circumstances that were just impossible. And with regard to the latter, we have even had American doctors testify in courtrooms that children as young as 3 or 4 can have huge objects and even knives forced regularly into their private parts without leaving the slightest trace or causing any pain. These were doctors, scientists. And of course, various forms of supposed alien abductions come to mind, where people can really believe in all sorts of strange things. And we can see people turning their own pain into sexual pleasure. We call them masochists if they go too far, but turning pain into sexual pleasure is quite common. And sporty people can often enjoy the various pains and aches in their muscles and lungs that arise out of their physical exertions. Never been there myself, but apparently it's true. And people might even enjoy the ferocious burning of hot curries and scorching chilies in their mouths, or the endless tales of woe and misery that positively pervade women's fiction, chat shows, and magazines. Consumers of these things clearly gain some kind of pleasure from other people's suffering. It certainly is a strange world. But as we have seen, we can go the other way and turn pleasure into pain by, for example, convincing people that what they did will do them harm, they'll be damaged for life, their careers will suffer, they will go to hell or something, and then what was once their pleasure can become their nightmare. In Nazi Germany, if a Nazi spat on a Jew, the Jew might well have thought that he'd had a good day. But if a Jew had spat on a Nazi, the Nazi's whole week might have been ruined. Superorganisms. In short, people's brains are incredibly malleable when it comes to what they perceive reality to be. But it is very hard for people to get to grips with this and to accept it. We just cannot really accept that our reality, what we believe to be, is totally constructed by our brains. And of especial importance here is the fact that it seems to be the case that if your brain thinks that believing in something is good for you, and that it is in your best interest, then it won't be long before your consciousness starts believing in it, or at the very least heads off in that direction, and gradually starts believing in it. And, crucially, enjoying the idea of it, as you traverse mental pathways that are designed to get you where your brain wants you to go, by altering your beliefs and your perceptions, and hence your reality. And so, for example, if Tribe A over there has important resources that Tribe B wants, then it won't be long before Tribe A is seen by Tribe B as consisting of wicked people who ought to be killed, or heavily disadvantaged in some way, so that they can get their hands on the resources. Bit by bit, the superorganism of Tribe B will demonize Tribe A through various methods and processes, some of them consciously engaged in, some of them not, and these shenanigans will push their own people into some kind of conflict with the others. Generally speaking, people will believe in what it profits them to believe in, and they will perceive the world and make value judgments about it in a manner that helps them, as always, to empower themselves. Even our moral codes are really designed to empower us. And if we look at the Ten Commandments, or some of them, for example, thou shalt have no other gods before me, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Well, this is all about empowering the priests. How fortuitous for them. And thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal. Well, these are good values to promote in other people, good morals, because you are less likely to be killed, or robbed, or have your wife sleep with another man. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbour, which is another way of saying, don't keep spreading lies about me. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbour's house, or his servants, or his animals. In other words, keep your hands off my stuff. They're all about empowerment. Our brains will change the very perception, our reality, even from our senses: taste, touch, smell, sound, and sight. Our brains alter our assessments of complex information and our emotional responses to them. And this is why one world government is dangerous, and why all superorganisms that have a lot of power are dangerous. They will use their power to change people's reality, and both they and the people who form them will engage in all sorts of shenanigans in order to empower themselves, including deception, dishonesty, demonization, discrimination, corruption, violence, intimidation, murder, and massacre, anything that they can get away with. We have seen this time and time again. And so, all in all, and in my view, the answer to the question, who rules over us, is obvious. They do. In the next podcast, we will take a closer look at the superorganisms that one might describe as governments, and at how, in the West, they have been using feminism in recent decades as a means of empowering themselves. Thank you for listening.